Hello, and welcome to the History of the Railways, a podcast with the ridiculous goal of telling the story of the railways across the world. Season 1, Episode 3, Putting It Together, the Stockton and Darlington Railway. On the 27th of September 1825, at 7:30 in the morning, a crowd gathered near St Helens, Auckland in County Durham. It was an unusual group, but then they had all come to see something unusual, in fact unique. There were people from all classes, from the nobility to the local labourers. There were people on horseback, in coaches and on foot, and they were all excited. Once the appointed hour had arrived, the crowd set off, following a train of coal chaldron wagons being pulled by horses. As they walked the half hour or so to Brusselton Incline, their first planned stop, more and more people joined in. By the time they arrived, there were thousands of them. At Brusselton, the wagons were slowly hauled up the incline. There were 13 of them in total, 12 loaded with coal and 1 with sacks of flour. But the horses didn't pull them up. Instead, they were hitched to a rope, and the newfangled stationary winding engine at the top of the hill did the work. This would have been the first time most of the crowd had seen anything like it. If you wanted something to move, you pushed it, or you hitched it to an animal. The same had been true for thousands of years. As one observer reported, their faces told the story. The happy faces of many, the vacant stare of astonishment of others, and the alarm depicted in the countenances of some. But more excitement was still to come. On the other side of the incline, the wagons were jockeyed into position behind something almost none of them could ever have seen, and which their parents couldn't even have imagined, the thing that had brought many of them out, the new locomotive engine. The stationary engine that pulled the wagons up the hill had been astonishing enough, but an engine that moved itself. Those of them that read the papers would have heard of them, of course, and whether they knew it or not, the crowd was standing in the centre of this new wonder of the age. All of the locos in the country, in the world in fact, were within 60 miles of where they stood. But they were all working in private collieries. This was something totally different. The Stockton and Darlington Railway Company had been planned from the beginning as a public railway. Anyone who was prepared to pay could use it. We'll have more to say about the engine later. For now, just know that while it had started life in the works being called active, by the time of its public debut, it had the name it would be remembered by in history: Locomotion Number 1. As the crowd watched, the train was assembled behind the engine. First came 5 of the coal wagons, and the 1 loaded with flour, coupled with loose chains to the engine. Behind them was another wagon with the surveyors and engineers, though not all of them, as we'll see in a moment, riding inside. Next was another novelty, a purpose-built carriage for the company's committee, what we'd think of as the board of directors, and their personal guests. Then 20 more wagons with passengers, the first 6 with what they termed strangers, and the other 14 with the company's workmen. Finally, there were another 6 of the coal wagons, a mixed train indeed. 300 tickets had been sold, but this first use of a steam-hauled passenger railway was also the occasion for another first, the first neverers. The Times reported on the 4th of October that 550 passengers were counted in the wagons, and if those clinging to the outsides were included, there must have been more than 600 people. In all, the train weighed between 80 and 90 tons, excluding the engine, although I don't know whether that estimate includes the neverers. Doing their best to organise all of the strangers were the company men. Most of them had blue ribbons in their buttonholes, while those acting as crew had broad blue sashes over their shoulders to mark them out. Whilst the names of most of the crew have been lost to the mists of time, and even the committee aren't remembered by most people, 2 of the men wearing sashes would rightly become famous: George Stephenson and Timothy Hackworth. Stephenson, as engineer of the line, had the honour of being the driver of the new locomotive, with his brother Jem as fireman. Hackworth acted as the guard. At about 10 a.m, Stephenson signalled to the men between the wagons to release the brakes, and the convoy set off towards Darlington. Just in case someone had missed the local and national newspaper reports and was unable to spot Locomotion Number 1, or hear the crowd hanging off the wagons, the company had secured the services of a horseman to ride on the line ahead of the engine, waving the flag. Whether he was supposed to be warning of the impending arrival or celebrating it, the record doesn't say, but in either case he can't really have achieved much. And funnily enough, although it's outside of the scope of our show, the first Locomotives on Highways Acts in the 1860s obliged motor cars to have the same thing, although in their case it was carried by a man at walking speed. 40 years earlier, the S&DR had at least given the man a horse. According to J.S. Jeans in the Jubilee Memorial from 1875, at one point the engine was able to reach 15 miles an hour, but Robert Young disputes that. He doesn't believe locomotion number 1 could achieve that speed, and in any case he quite rightly points out that it wouldn't have been good advertising to run over the herald leading the way with his flag. But whatever the top speed that was reached on that day, the engine and the railway more generally certainly made an impression. As the reporter for the Newcastle Courant wrote, "In contemplating the events of the day, either in a national point of view or as the efforts of a company of individuals, furnishing a speedy, efficacious and certain means of traffic to a wide and extended district, it alike excites their deepest interest and admiration. And the immense train of carriages covered with people, forming a load of 80 to 90 tons, gliding as it were smoothly and majestically along the railway, through files of spectators, at such an astonishing rate of speed, left an impression on those who witnessed it that will never be forgot. The railway had definitely arrived. But getting there hadn't been easy." 7 years earlier, on the evening of the 13th of November 1818, a group of local businessmen held an incredibly important meeting in the town hall at Darlington. For years there'd been stop-start attempts by the town worthies of Stockton and Darlington to connect the coalfields around Bishop Auckland and Shildon to the River Tees. There'd been plans for a canal, including one by the elder John Rennie, but none of these had got further than the drawing board. By 1818, both the hour and the man, or men, had cometh. The people at the meeting seemed to have all accepted that they would be doing something this time, but there was still fierce debate about whether that something should be a canal or a railway. The leaders of the railway party were an interconnected group of local Quaker businessmen. Two in particular took charge, Edward Pease and Jonathan Backhouse. Backhouse had a particularly entertaining part to play, which we'll see later, but it was Pease who was the prime motivator throughout, so most of our story will focus on him. Edward Pease deserves to be much better known. In fact, even in an 1844 article on railways in Fraser's magazine, said, "We hope the time may never come when the millions at home and abroad who enjoy the advantages of railways shall have forgotten that they owe them all to Mr. Edward Pease of Darlington." Well, sadly, most have. So what can we say about Edward Pease? He was born in 1767 into a successful Quaker family. His grandfather, also called Edward, because why make this easy for people listening to podcasts 250 years later, had set up a wool combing and weaving business in 1746, and that became the foundation of the family's wealth. By the time Edward, our Edward, was born, it was already successful and had branched out into banking. If that sounds like a strange step, then you'll just have to trust me. It wasn't as strange as it sounds now. Many successful merchants did the same thing at the time. Nathan Rothschild, the founder of the English branch of the rather more famous banking family, started as a textile merchant in Manchester before beginning his banking activities. Anyway, back to Edward. He was born into security and comfort, joined the family firm at 14 and led a successful career, establishing a reputation for fair and honest dealing. By the time of the meeting in 1818, he was already 51 and starting to step back from his day-to-day work. On that night, he stood up and convinced the meeting to back the railway. The Canal Party hadn't done themselves any favours by puffing up their report and its possible earnings, so when Jonathan Backhouse spoke, he roundly mocked their extravagant claims and took apart the numbers they'd based them on. But it was Edward Pease who sealed the deal with a good helping of northern common sense. "This short piece of road yields me 5%, and this is enough. Some perhaps can make it out to be 6, or 8, or 10, or 12%. I do not know how much. There is ample room for calculation. But I am quite satisfied with my 5%. The assembled businessmen were no doubt left thinking that the 28% return the Canal Party had been promising earlier in the evening sounded too good to be true. Pease's focus on realistic targets won the day, and the minutes of the fateful meeting read, "Resolved, that a rail or tramway throughout the entire line between Stockton and the collieries, with branches communicating with Peersbridge, Croft and Yarm, is, under existing circumstances, preferable to a canal, and that it is of importance to carry it into effect with as little delay as possible. So that was it, done. Everybody who had the idea agreed, and once they got the small matter of building it out of the way, the railway age launched in grand style. Only joking, obviously. For a start, I should quickly point out that the railway Pease and Backhouse and their colleagues had been arguing for wasn't a steam railway. The benefit they saw were in the rails themselves. As far as motive power went, at this point, they were just assuming the traffic would be hauled by a horse. The question of what would run on it would be raised slightly later. First, the railway had to get built. And as we saw in episode 1, before it could be built, a company needed to be formed by Act of Parliament. As part of producing plans to submit to Parliament, the company tried to get permission from the landowners for the railway to cross their land. As you might expect, that got a mixed response. Several of the landowners were in favour, some of them no doubt persuaded by the committee's realistic numbers that this would be a good thing for business. Some that it might increase the value of their land, some perhaps even that it would be good for the local area. Others were rather more focused on the fact that it would upset their fox hunting. Well, I say others, primarily the Earl of Darlington. Lord Darlington was the great-grandson of one of Charles II's bastards, and he owned huge estates which he used for his great passion, hunting. Unfortunately for the S&DR, the proposed line cut across a fox cover he used, sometimes, and we really couldn't have that, could we? To be fair to the man, he never pretended to be anything other than completely opposed when the committee approached him. In February 1819, he wrote to them from Raby Castle, rebuffing a compromise they had proposed in no uncertain terms. The measure you allude to appears to me now, as it has done before, to be harsh and oppressive, and injurious to the interests of the country. By interests of the country here, I think he means himself. Still, the committee went ahead and submitted their plans to Parliament in May 1819 for a vote. It failed by 13 votes. But neither side saw that as the end of things. The committee instantly restarted work on a revised plan, and the Earl, seeing the way things were heading, tried another route to kill the whole thing. And this is where Jonathan Backhouse makes another entry to our story. Backhouse came from a family very similar to the Peases. In fact, he and Edward were first cousins. The Backhouses had also started out in textiles, before branching out into banking, but Jonathan's father had concentrated on growing the banking side of the business and letting the textile piece slip. And according to Mabley Phillips's 1894 A History of Banks in Northumberland, the Backhouse Bank had branches in Darlington, Durham and Sunderland amongst others, and was one of the most stable influences in the finance of northern business. The Backhouse Bank was absolutely essential to the success or failure of the S&DR, a point that wasn't lost on the Earl of Darlington. In those days, banks issued their own currency, and anyone with a banknote could demand that it was exchanged for gold. If the bank didn't have enough gold to meet the demand, then it would start a spiralling lack of confidence, with other depositors withdrawing their money and the bank very quickly going out of business. Obviously, banks didn't really keep in enough gold to redeem all of the notes they'd issued, but normally that wasn't a problem. After all, what are the chances that all of your customers are going to turn up and demand their share of the gold at the same time? Not very high. Unless, of course, you've upset a local earl. Darlington's agents told the tenants on his land to start discreetly collecting as many Backhouse banknotes as possible, so that he could demand more than the amount of gold held by the bank and ruin them. The month after the vote in Parliament, Jonathan Backhouse was tipped off about the plan, and worse, learnt that Darlington's men were only days away from pulling the trigger. He raced to London, gathered and borrowed as much gold bullion as possible, and raced back north so that he'd be able to meet their order, although racing before the railways meant something like a 40-hour round trip. He must have been quite pleased with himself, though, as his coach and four powered back along the Great North Road, but as he was crossing Croft Bridge, only 3.5 miles from his bank, disaster struck. Finally breaking under the weight of the bullion, one of the front wheels came off his coach and he came crashing to a stop. There was no way to reattach the wheel, and it looked like it was all over for Backhouse's bank and the Stockton and Darlington Railway. But of course, we wouldn't be talking about it today if that was the case. Jonathan Backhouse wasn't the sort of man to be stopped by a little thing like the lack of a wheel. He piled all of the gold to the back of the coach, raising the front off the ground, and ordered his driver to carry on into Darlington on 2 wheels. Presumably carefully. In one version of the story, Jonathan arrived breathless just before the Earl of Darlington's agent and was able to meet his demands by handing over the gold personally. That seems a little too neat to be true for me, but what is definitely true is that Jonathan Backhouse's mad dash to London and his quick thinking on the bridge prevented Lord Darlington's attempt to prompt a run on the bank and kill the S&DR. Backhouse's bank survived. In 1896, it became one of the main players in the combination that formed Barclays Bank. In a very real sense, it's still around today. The Earl of Darlington, on the other hand, isn't. In 1833, he was made the Duke of Cleveland, and on his death his 3 sons inherited his titles in turn. All of them died without legitimate male descendants, and the titles went extinct. And the S&DR? Well, we know what happened to that. Undaunted by Lord Darlington's manipulations, the committee resubmitted the Act to Parliament, and after a delay caused by the death of King George III in 1820, it was finally approved on the 19th of April 1821, and the railway was ready to be built. There's some dispute about precisely when Edward Pease first met George Stephenson. Nicholas Wood, who was with them, remembered it as being on the 19th of April, but it seems a hell of a coincidence that it was the same day as the Act passed. What we do know for certain is that by the end of July, Pease was writing to Stephenson, proposing he become the engineer of the line and asking him to quote for a survey. Demonstrating that he was no mere hands-off financial backer, Pease asked Stephenson to consider whether the line would be best as single or double track, and whether it should be made from wrought or malleable iron. Stephenson's reply is amusing to anyone who's ever hired a builder. Sir, after carefully examining your favour, I find it impossible to form an accurate idea of what such a survey would cost, as not only the old line must be gone over, but all the other deviating parts, which will be equal to a double survey, and indeed it must be done in a very different manner from your former one, so as to enable me to make a correct measurements of all the cuts and batteries on the whole line. It would, I think, occupy me at least 5 weeks. My charge shall include all necessary assistance for the accomplishment of the survey, estimates of the expense of cuts and batteries on the different projected lines, together with all the remarks, reports, etc. of the same. Also, the comparative cost of malleable iron and cast iron rails, winning and preparing the blocks of stone, and all materials wanted to complete the line. I could not do this for less than £140, allowing me to be moderately paid. Underneath the polite 19th century language, you can almost hear the sharp intake of breath. I don't know, Governor, it's going to cost you. Nonetheless, the two men obviously hit it off, and Stephenson became inextricably linked with both the S&DR and Edward Pease. Stephenson carried out his survey with the help of John Dixon, who would later become the S&DR's permanent way engineer, and who, it's worth noting in passing, also belonged to a fairly illustrious family. His great-uncle was Jeremiah Dixon, who helped map the Mason-Dixon line in the US, and one of his nephews, Wayneman, discovered the only Egyptian artefacts found inside the Great Pyramid. Wayneman's brother, another John, designed the iron cylinder that was used to transport Cleopatra's Needle to London. I have to say, one of the dangers of focusing on this period of history is the definite feeling of inadequacy it leaves you with. Anyway, when the survey started, George Stephenson took the opportunity to bring his son Robert, just now approaching his 18th birthday, into the project. Until this point, Robert had been working as an apprentice to Nicholas Wood at Killingworth. The usual explanation for his leaving his apprenticeship is that ill health meant he wasn't suited to life spent as a pit viewer. But while there isn't any evidence, I think we can probably assume that between them, George and Robert saw that there would be more opportunity for a young man to make his future in the new railways than there would be inspecting mines. After all, there must have been plenty of men and lads in the pits who were suffering from tuberculosis, and none of the rest of them were excused for ill health. While working on the survey, Stephenson came to the conclusion that the line would be better run along a route that missed Darlington out. Dixon mentioned it in passing to Edward Pease, but Pease wasn't amused. He summoned Stephenson and reminded him that he was working on behalf of the people of Darlington. "You've been employed to improve the line, not take it away," he's reported to have said. But this gentle rebuke clearly didn't sour things between the two of them. In October 1821, Pease wrote to his cousin Thomas Richardson, who we'll meet again before the end of this episode. It's worth quoting it in full, not only for what it tells us about Pease's opinion of Stephenson, but for what we learn about the future use of locomotives. This was October 1821, remember. "Dear cousin, the more we see of Stephenson, the more we are pleased with him. He commences the setting out of the line in a few days. He is altogether a self-taught genius, a man thee would be remarkably pleased with. There is such a scale of sound ability without anything assuming. Cousin Jonathan, Joseph, and myself," that's Jonathan Backhouse and Pease's son Joseph, went to see his works about 5 miles from Newcastle, and were exceedingly pleased with the correctness of everything he had designed and executed. Don't be surprised if I should tell thee, there seems to us after careful examination no difficulty of laying a railroad from London to Edinburgh, on which waggons would travel and take the mail at the rate of 20 miles per hour. When this is accomplished, steam vessels may be laid aside. We went along a road upon one of these engines, conveying about 50 tons at the rate of 7 or 8 miles per hour, and if the same power had been applied to speed, which was applied to drag the waggons, we should have gone 50 miles per hour. Previous to seeing this locomotive engine, I was at a loss to conceive how the engine could draw such a weight, without either having a rack with teeth laid in the ground and wheels with teeth to work into the same, or something like legs. But in this engine there is no such thing. The way and wheels are exactly the same as common rail, and by the cranks of the engine first propelling the fore wheels of the waggon and then the hind wheels, the loaded waggons are impelled forward. From all this judicious man says, and all we can yet see, no doubt has yet entered my mind, but we shall make a good thing of this concern. So I've quoted that in full because there's a couple of little bits throughout it that I think were just fascinating. We can see that Stephenson, even at this early stage, was looking to persuade Pease to use locomotives on the line, and Pease was receptive. But we should remember that at this point it was still far from decided. The 1821 Act was completely silent on motive power. The Stephensons and Dixon completed the survey by the end of the year. George reported back that the line could indeed be built as described in the Act, but that a revised route, one that still took in Darlington this time, would be shorter. Pease and the committee were impressed enough that they made George Stephenson official engineer of the line on the 22nd of January 1822. His salary was £660 per year to cover him and his assistants. In May 1822, the first length of rail was laid by the company's chairman, Thomas Meynell, and from that point on, work on the line didn't stop. Stephenson's answer to Pease's original 2 questions, single or double track and cast or malleable iron, had been single track and malleable rails. The first was accepted. The line was built as single track with sidings every quarter of a mile. But the question of what material to use was thornier. A dispute amongst the committee meant that they landed on a compromise. It would be mostly malleable rolled iron in line with Stephenson's recommendation, but about 3 miles worth of cast iron was also laid. The cast iron rails were 4-foot lengths, while the malleable ones used Birkinshaw's patented rolled rail design and were a mix of 12 and 15 feet long. Both the cast and the malleable were fish-belly in profile and sat in cast iron chairs, supported by a mix of stone and wooden sleepers. I've steered clear of any reference to gauge in the series up until now, because we'll cover it more properly in an episode of its own in the future, but it's worth knowing that the S&DR was pretty much what would become standard gauge. I say pretty much because there are authorities who suggest that the line of the S&DR varied between what we call standard gauge, that is 4 foot 8.5 inches, and sections of slightly narrower 4 foot 8. This is Robert Young's position, for example, in 1923, when he said that a trifling variation of half an inch or so not being then deemed of much importance. But it looks like that's just wrong. When the Liverpool and Manchester representatives visited in 1824, they reported back that the gauge was 4 foot 8 inches flat. And we can assume that they'd have been careful about it, since they were specifically on a fact-finding mission for their own line. Added to which, no less a person than John Dixon, who ought to have known given that he was responsible for building the permanent way and maintaining it later, said in 1846, "I can testify to the fact of there being half an inch difference in the gauge of the Great North of England Railway and the Stockton and Darlington Railway, and that engines and carriages reciprocally travel on each line daily without danger or a suspicion thereof from that cause. Indeed, the fact of this difference is not generally known." As we'll see in the later episode, by 1846 the Battle of the Gauges was well underway, so if Dixon was going to bend the truth at all, he'd definitely have gone the other way and said it was standard. This is just an honest man admitting that it isn't quite the same, but it's close enough as makes no difference. To carry out the work of building the line, the S&DR followed the mixed model I described in episode 1. Stephenson broke the line up into mile-long stretches and let separate contracts to build each one, with prices based on how much work the section should take. The estimates seem to have been close enough in most cases to satisfy everyone, but as you'd expect, they were sometimes wide of the mark. On one occasion, Stephenson reported back to the committee that he'd paid the men extra because the work had been underestimated. The dryness of the season and the strong nature of the clay in the cuttings have greatly damped the spirits of the undertakers, in consequence of which I thought it prudent to advance the price 1 penny per yard more than their bargains, which is still below my estimate. I hope that they will now go on cheerfully. And in at least one instance, a contractor simply walked away from the cutting they'd taken on, despite having already excavated 4,000 cubic yards. As we also saw in episode 1 was often the case, most of the actual labourers were local men. But in October 1822, there was a strike in Tyneside by the keelmen, the men who loaded the coals from Newcastle onto flat-bottomed boats and ran it along the Tyne. The strike only lasted 3 months, but some of those who were made redundant came to work on the S&DR. In fact, in a complete aside, when those keelmen went on strike, William Headley, who we met in episode 2, came up with a solution for the coal owners. He transported his Wylam-Dilly locomotive to the Tyne, installed it on a keel, and fitted paddle wheels to turn it into a tug. You can see a picture of it working along the river at historyoftherailways.com/episode 3. If you look closely, you can see men standing beside the engine holding what look like sticks. They're redcoats who had to guard the strike-bearing engine from attack by the men, and the sticks are muskets. But back to the S&DR. The final report that the committee produced for the opening day showed that the number of bridges had been greatly underestimated, and they cost a lot more than was expected. However, most of them were what's known as accommodation or occupation bridges. When the line divided the landowner's land into 2 sections, the company had to build an accommodation bridge so they could get from one side to the other without crossing the line. I'm sure there's a joke about chickens buried in here somewhere, but I'm going to skip it. You can thank me later. The accommodation bridges were small things and well within the techniques of the time, but there are 2 bridges on the line that are worth mentioning briefly before I move on from the permanent way and discuss the locomotive and carriages. They are the Skerne Bridge and Gornless Bridge. George Stephenson designed Gornless Bridge himself. It's been called the first iron railway bridge, but that isn't quite right. Iron Bridge in Shropshire had been built in 1781. That was definitely the first iron bridge in Britain, and as far as I know, the world. But it carried a road rather than a railway. In 1793, just 2 miles from Penydarren, where Trevithick would build his first loco 11 years later, the first iron railway bridge, Ponty Caffnow, sorry Welsh speakers, it's about to get worse, was built at Cyfarthfa Ironworks. In a small world moment, Cyfarthfa had been owned by Samuel Humphrey's father, but he'd sold it to fund his son's interest in Penydarren. This was the Samuel Humphrey who'd made that famous bet about Trevithick's engine. Anyway, Gornless Bridge was not the first iron railway bridge. It wasn't even designed to take locomotives. That section of the S&DR was drawn by horses. That said, it is an interesting design. Stephenson used lenticular trusses, something Brunel would later do much more famously on the Royal Albert. At Gornless, though, Stephenson used the trusses underneath the platform, something I've not seen on any others. To picture a lenticular truss, just imagine an egg with pointed ends. It's a strong shape, for precisely the same reason an egg is. The stresses are distributed evenly. Okay, it doesn't work quite like an egg, but you get the point. There was nothing new about Skerne Bridge, on the other hand. The River Skerne is a tributary of the Tees that passes through Darlington, and the bridge is just a traditional masonry arch bridge designed by the local architect Ignatius Bonomi. But it's worth a mention for 2 reasons. Firstly, because if you see pictures of the S&DR opening day, they almost always show locomotion number 1 pulling its train across a bridge. It even appeared on the Bank of England's £5 note from 1990 until 2002. The bridge they all show is Skerne Bridge. And secondly, because unlike Gornless, it was used to carry locomotive traffic, including, as the pictures show, on the opening day. And since it's still being used today, that makes it the oldest railway bridge that's been in continuous use in the whole of the world. Interestingly, the image of the bridge that appears most often, including the one on the old £5 note, is actually wrong. It's obviously supposed to be the opening day, as it shows locomotion number 1 preceded by a man on horseback with a flag. But the bridge itself has sweeping side buttresses, and they weren't added until 1829. So, through 1822 and 23, the sections of the line which fell within the original Act were being built. But Stephenson's survey had recommended changes to that route, and in 1823 they returned to Parliament to get another Act authorising the new route. It was this 1823 Act that gave the company the 2 powers that make them such a key part of our story: the right to use locomotives and the right to carry passengers. Chapter 8 of the Act approved by Parliament on the 23rd of May says, and I've edited chunks out here because you don't want all of the said companies and which-fors, but it says, "Be it further enacted that it shall and may be lawful for the said company of proprietors to make and erect such and so many locomotive or movable engines as they shall think proper and expedient, and for the conveyance of passengers upon and along the same roads." So that was it, the beginning of the public steam railway as we know it. So now let's take a look at the locos and the carriages. First, the locomotives. As we saw earlier, Edward Pease had been impressed by the locos George Stephenson had showed him as early as 1821, so the fact that the 1823 Act allowed for it shouldn't come as any surprise. And we know that by early 1824, when the Liverpool and Manchester group came on their fact-finding mission, the S&DR people shared that they were expecting the motive power to include steam-powered locos amongst the other options. But we shouldn't let hindsight make us read too much into either of these points. In fact, it looks as though the committee as a whole didn't really think in detail about engines until July 1824. Until then, their focus was quite rightly on just getting the line built. After all, the railway was the goal. All of the benefits they'd calculated, Pease's famous 5%, came from the line being operated by horses. Steam engines were just an optional extra. So much for the committee as a whole, but there were some amongst them who were determined to make steam-powered locomotives part of the answer at least. And they had been planning for it a year earlier than the rest of the committee. In June 1823, the very month after the Act was approved, a new company was formed to focus on building engines, Robert Stephenson and Company. There were 4 shareholders, George Stephenson, Robert Stephenson, the ubiquitous Edward Pease, and a 4th man we met in passing earlier, Pease's cousin Thomas Richardson. We're not going to talk about Richardson much, but in a very real way, he could be said to bookend the first age of railways. I glossed over him earlier because his role in Robert Stephenson and Company stands out more, but as a money man, he was instrumental to the S&DR from the very beginning. He was a part of the same Quaker business community as Pease and Backhouse, but if anything, he was even more successful than them. He was certainly richer and more tied to the wider establishment. In 1800, he had set up a bill brokerage in London called Richardson, Overend and Company. By the 1820s, it was one of the most respected financial institutions in the city, and, as a result, the world. It maintained that position for the whole of Richardson's life, but to anyone familiar with 1860s finance, and come on, who isn't, the name of that bank will sound vaguely reminiscent. In 1866, 13 years after Richardson had died, the bank he'd founded collapsed, though by then it was known as Overend Gurney and Company. Overend Gurney's failure triggered an international financial panic that led, amongst other failures, to the failure of several railways and the downfall of some important contractors, as we'll see when we look at Sir Samuel Morton Peto later in the series. But in 1823, that all lay in the future, and when Edward Pease asked his cousin Thomas to invest in Robert Stephenson and Company, he did so gladly. He was already a fan of the Stephensons and a convert to the idea that steam engines were the future. When it was founded, the company was divided between the 4 men. Pease and Richardson could obviously afford a new investment. George was able to invest money he had been awarded for inventing a mining safety lamp some years earlier. Robert's share was financed by Edward Pease. So once again, we have Edward Pease at the centre of a key project. Without him and his cousin Richardson, there would have been no Robert Stephenson and Company, and potentially no rocket. But I'm getting ahead of myself again. The company was formed in the middle of 1823. In August, they bought the site on which the 4th Street Works would be built, and in October, the S&DR ordered the stationary engines to work the inclines at Etherley and Brustleton. The reason for the vast order hardly needs to be spelt out. It's not like there was a modern tendering process or separation of powers at play. The orders came from one of Pease's companies to another of Pease's companies. Wearing his S&DR hat, he instructed Robert Stephenson and Company that they were to build the engine to the specification provided by the chief engineer of his railway, George Stephenson. In reality, we know that Robert worked directly on the design for the Brustleton stationary engine, the larger of the two, because he said so himself in a later letter to Samuel Smiles. But by the time the next, and in our view the most important, order landed, Robert had already left the country. In July 1824, a month after Robert set sail, to the surprise and dismay of his colleagues, he had agreed to a 3-year contract in Colombia. the S&DR asked Robert Stephenson and Company to quote for 2 locomotive engines. George produced the design, and the price of £550 each was accepted. It's interesting to note that this was a fraction of the price of the stationary engines. Etherley cost just under £2,000 and Brusselton £3,500. On the 16th of September, the S&DR committee accepted the quote and formally ordered the 2 locomotives. Over the next year, while work on the line continued, the 4th Street Works built the first of 4 locomotives to the same design. Called active while it was at the works, it was always referred to as Locomotion No. 1 by the S&DR. When the committee advertised the opening of the line in early September 1825, they proudly trumpeted that a superior locomotive travelling engine of the most improved construction will be employed with a train of convenient carriages for the conveyance of the proprietors and strangers. But that was overstating the case in 2 ways. Locomotion No. 1 was a credible engine, but far from being most improved. It was pretty run-of-the-mill. It was an 040, thank God we're past all of that white doesn't apply nonsense. It had 4-foot cast iron wheels, 2 vertical cylinders 10 inches by 24, and a boiler 4 foot in diameter and 10 foot long, with a single flue. At the end of episode 2, I summarised the state of the locomotive art in the early 1820s, and if you remember, I said the typical engine had 4 wheels, 2 vertical cylinders driving the wheels directly, drive wheels coupled via gears or chains, and single or return flue boilers. The only one of these key elements that Locomotion No. 1 improved upon was the coupling. It was the first engine to be coupled using rods, a feature which would obviously become standard on all engines going forward. Apart from the coupling rods, the only other change from Stephenson's Killingworth engines was the way the power was transmitted from the cylinders to the connecting rods, and it's difficult to call that an improvement. The arrangement used on Locomotion No. 1 was much closer to the Wylam practice and has been described as a backward step. In any case, it would be completely superseded shortly when cylinders began to be mounted horizontally, but we'll get to that in the next episode. Which leaves us with rolling stock before we wrap up. I said a moment ago that the advert made 2 claims that were a bit of a stretch. Well, the second was to the train of convenient carriages. As we saw at the start of the episode, the proprietors might have had a convenient carriage, but everybody else rode in open wagons if they were lucky, and clinging to the outside if they weren't. On the opening day, those wagons belonged to the company themselves, but we should remember that the plan was for the Stockton Darlington to operate as a toll road. The railway company was originally intended to own just that, the railway. The services that ran along it would be run by other people who would pay a fee to the railway company. A model that wouldn't really be seen again in Britain until 1994 and the creation of Railtrack. The owners of the S&DR ditched that approach very quickly and started running their own services by October. Albeit they weren't exclusive, they did still allow other companies and individuals to pay to run services on the line. But in any case, at day 1, the only rolling stock on the line belonged to the S&DR themselves. In early September 1825, the committee reported that as well as the locomotive, the company owned 150 wagons and the purpose-built passenger carriage that they would be riding in on opening day. Called Experiment, which is a bit confusing as there'd be an engine built for the Liverpool and Manchester by the same name, the passenger carriage was delivered on the 26th of September, the night before the opening. The undercarriage had been built by Robert Stephenson and Company, while the body had been entrusted to a stagecoach builder, whose name I haven't been able to find. The coach had doors at both ends and 2 cushioned bench seats running along each side, separated by a single long table. The floor was carpeted and the windows glazed, which may not sound like an extravagance, but given the state most passengers travelled in for the next 20 years or so, it was quite the treat. The coach's name and the company's motto were painted on the outside. The ride was comfortable enough given the standards of the time. An early passenger, admittedly a year or 2 later, reported, "The coach had no springs of any kind, and yet the motion was fully as easy as in any coach on the road. A very slight jolt is felt, accompanied with a click or rattle, every time the wheels pass over the joints of the several rails, and also at the brakes, which occur at the different passing places, and then if anything feels harsher than in a coach. Some parts of the way were laid with rails of cast iron, joined at every 4 feet, and in coming upon these, the jerks and jolts were more frequent, more audible, and more sensible." Still, given the state of the highway roads at the time, this can't have been that bad. The committee were obviously happy enough with their first ride because they quickly decided to continue using Experiment to carry passengers. On the 7th of October, they decided to apply for a licence to carry passengers, meaning of course that the opening day was illegal, but we'll gloss over that since it appears the magistrates did the same. And they started regular passenger services between Stockton and Darlington from the 10th of October. The fare was 1 shilling per passenger, but anyone who's ever travelled on a budget airline will be pleased to learn that from the very first adverts, the company was at pains to point out that your baggage was limited. Passengers will be allowed a package of not exceeding £14, all above that weight to pay at the rate of 2p per stone extra. Of course, if any of the passengers would be irritated by those limitations in future, they certainly weren't on the 27th of September 1825. We left the opening day train in the morning as locomotion number 1 pulled away from Brusselton, drawing the Experiment and wagon loads of friends and strangers behind it. About 6 hours later, George Stephenson drove it into Stockton to a 21-gun salute, and the bandwagon, literally 2 wagons had been coupled to the train at Darlington carrying a band, struck up God Save the King. Huge celebratory dinners put on by the company for all of the local gentry and the workers who had built the line went on into the early hours of the morning. The day had been a complete success. Only one sad note marred it. Edward Pease, the man most responsible for it, wasn't there. He missed the opening day of the railway for the saddest of reasons. His pocketbook for the day contains no mention of the railway. Instead, the entry reads only, 9th month, 27th. My beloved son Isaac departed this life with consoling faith that his heavenly Father had prepared a blessed mansion for him. Only 4 months earlier, the Pease family lost their daughter Mary at the age of 23, and now, on what should have been a day of beginnings, their 19-year-old son Isaac also passed away. Edward Pease doesn't appear in our story again. He stayed in the northeast. He recovered enough from his children's death to remain an active local businessman, even founding the town of Middlesbrough. The story of the railways, meanwhile, moves outwards across the country and then the world. But when we're thinking about railways, like the writer in Fraser's magazine that I quoted earlier said, we shouldn't forget that we owe them all to Mr. Edward Pease of Darlington. So that brings us to the end of our run through the S&DR. By its opening day, the longest railway in the country had been built, steam locomotives were running regular services on it, and the careers of several key figures in the railway industry had been launched. So what's left to say? Is that the history of the railways complete? Why does the Liverpool and Manchester so often get called the first railway? Well, the focus of the Stockton and Darlington Railway was always mineral haulage. Until 1832, it averaged only 500 or so passengers a week. As a result, the steam locos were designed for low speed, high power. They didn't even pull another passenger train until 1833. The Experiment and its descendants were pulled by horses for the first 8 years. The locos were restricted to goods wagons. The S&DR helped prove what was possible, and after a bumpy financial start, its proprietors did well out of it. But if that was the end of our story, the railways would never have had the impact they did. Luckily for us, that isn't the end of it. Across the country, there were other groups looking at the success of the S&DR and seeing wider possibilities. But those wider possibilities would need better engines. In the next episode, we'll look at the Rainhill trials run by the LNMR and see what those better engines might look like. But before we go, here's a quick trivia question for you. Apart from some of Trevithick's experiments, all of the working engines we've covered until now have had vertical cylinders. What was the name of the first locomotive to have inclined cylinders? I'll give the answer on the next episode in a fortnight, and if you can't wait that long, then check out historyoftherailways.com, where you can find episode show notes and the answer to today's question. So, come and join me on the next episode as we look at the Rainhill trials of 1829. If you're enjoying the show, please like, subscribe and leave a review wherever you get your podcasts. And remember, you can find relevant images and links to the source material I used for research on historyoftherailways.com, where you'll also find ways to support the show. If you want to get in touch, then just drop me a line at michael@historyoftherailways.com or follow us on Facebook and join the conversation there. So tell your friends to come and join us on the next episode as we get distracted, fascinated and yes, even sidetracked by the stories from the history of the railways.